One more speaker who really doesn't need an introduction, especially to an audience like this. He's not only an acclaimed filmmaker and tireless activist, but also an all-too-rare voice of radical dissent and genuine compassion within popular culture, Ken Loach.
Thanks very much. I think it's a really important meeting, discussing a really important subject, and the research that has been done by the Media Reform Coalition is really important, and I trust everybody will get hold of it on their phone or Bluetooth or internet or whatever it is and read it, because it's ammunition. It's ammunition in demonstrating that we have a real problem in getting a fair representation for Jeremy Corbyn and the whole new movement in the Labour Party. There have been some terrific things said, and I don't want to repeat stuff that you've already heard, but I think it's quite interesting to, we talked about media bias, it's quite interesting to think, well, just what is this in practice? Because what are we missing, and how are they manipulating the ideas that they're transmitting? How come how are they attempting to manipulate our people's consciousness? Because I think it's quite specific. It is partly, of course, that they have people on who will attack Jeremy Corbyn, yes. But it's also how the presenters, how the anchors, how the commentators present the questions, how the questions they ask, the subtext to what they're asking, how they put stories together, and so that there is almost a collage of words and ideas and questions that together transmit the point of view they want you to have. So that's the first point I wanted to make, with just one or two examples. Now, you will have known, or maybe you won't, that Jeremy Corbyn had a series of press conferences in the last couple of weeks in which he outlined various policies. Now, in any normal election, the policies the candidates stand on would be the basis for the discussion. That's what you would argue about. That's where people would say, yes, that's a good policy, no, it's a bad policy. What's interesting here is that they weren't reported. Now, there was a press conference headed Secure Our National Health Service and Social Care. And there were some really important things said. I scoured the paper, I scoured The Guardian, I listened to quite as many of the news reports as I could. I didn't hear a word of this. Now, tell me if you heard this. Did you hear that he would end health service privatisation and bring services into a secure, publicly provided NHS? Integrate the National Health Service and social care for older and disabled people. Introduce legislation to unpick 25 years of marketisation, end the purchaser-provider split, return the NHS to an accountable public. I didn't hear that. Did you hear that there would be a national investment bank to buy out organisations from their PFI schemes? A very precise commitment. PFI, we know, is draining the resources of National Health Service and the education services with the buildings that are being put up and rip us off. There's a precise commitment, not discussed. Parity for mental health, and so on. Abolish the cap on public sector pay increase. Now, there's a huge issue for people who work in the public sector. There's a commitment. I didn't hear about it. I didn't hear about it until I asked them today. We discovered these documents. Didn't hear about it. End 0 hours contracts. Lift the statutory minimum wage to the living wage. So that was help. Didn't hear a word. Now, I was also asked to provide an endorsement for the news conference about the arts, which I did, and I was pleased to do, because it promised to give the arts the prominence that they had in the 1945 election manifesto. Really put the arts right at the centre of our common experience. An entitlement to theatre, music, and so on, to the people. Not so that it has to be sponsored by Shell, or you can't you can't have an artistic function unless it's sponsored by a big corporation. An end to that, and particularly establishing minimum sectors of pay for people in the artistic and creative industry is really important in my business, where people in films, young people are crucified. They're being told, for the benefit of your for the benefit of your CV, you have to work for nothing. Okay, you've got to work for nothing to get a CV. Corbyn's Labour Party would introduce a living wage for people in those industries, and particularly for those people who have marched to defend the libraries. A guarantee, a commitment to reopen public libraries. That's a big issue for a lot of communities. A big issue. Didn't hear a word of that. Not a word. And finally, energy. I could go on. Time is short. I won't go through it all. But a big press conference on energy and the environment. Really precise commitments here. The creation of over 200 local energy companies, giving towns, cities and localities the powers they need to drive a clean, locally accountable energy system. 200 local energy companies. Now that's quite precise. You would think they would examine that. You would think they would say, well, how are you going to make this work? Silence, silence. And that failure, and this is particularly true for the BBC, which should be our national broadcasting institution of record. If those issues, those precise commitments are not in the public domain, that's a serious loss for our democratic process. So I think the BBC in particular, and of course the Guardian tucked a bit of it away in some remote corner after they finished taking the picture of Jeremy sitting on the train floor. Tucked away. Okay, so that's a failure to report. There's 2 or 3 points where they've taken an issue and presented their view of it in the way they do it. So think of the deselection of MPs. Now, the deselection of MPs is presented as a threat. Will you promise not to deselect MPs? Is the substance of that's their line. Now, think about that. The right to oppose that, of course, is that the Labour Party members have the right to be represented by somebody they choose. That's the right. Being an MP is not a job for life, but that's not the inference of the way they present it. Think about the purge. Now, the purge has been extraordinary. I've never known anything like it. Well, I don't even apply because I know I won't be accepted. Too dangerous. But the people are being purged all over the place. We know they're being purged. People are being purged for retweeting something Caroline Lucas said or something, where the policies overlap to a great extent, particularly with Jeremy as leader. People are being purged for ridiculous reasons. The BBC I heard them run one story about a purge. Guess whose story it was? The guy who claimed that Jeremy Corbyn's supporters were like Nazi stormtroopers. He was purged, and that's the story they ran. That's the story they ran. What was his name? Michael Fisher, is it? Or Foster. Right. Should go to Gloucester. Michael Foster. He was purged, and that was the story, and it was on the Sunday Politics programme, I believe. And John McDonnell was on, and John McDonnell said he opposed purges, but the inference of the story was that it was Corbyn supporters that were doing the purging. That was the inference, when we know the opposite is the truth, and there's been no investigation into that. And that's an absolute way in which one story which is absolutely supportive of Jeremy Corbyn is twisted so that it's, in a perverse way, works against him. Take the other issue. A quarter to a third of the members are excluded from voting. Now, just imagine, if that had been a Corbyn group, had excluded a third to a quarter of the members, that would have been the story day after day after day. It would have been like the miners' ballot in the miners' strike. It would have driven this campaign remorselessly. But because it was the right wing that cut them out, doesn't exist anymore. Doesn't exist anymore. It's not there. The story doesn't exist. And one last one, the NHS. Now, 2 days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, there was a story in the press, a big story, they ran the story, that there was a report about the NHS that said that it was chronically underfunded. It would have to ration basic procedures. Non-emergency procedures would get cancelled. The money wasn't there. It was underfunded. I guess everybody remembers that story, right? Isn't it strange that the junior doctors have been saying this week after week for months and months and months, and the only question they're asked is, how can you put patients' lives at risk? That's the only question they're asked. So how come, when there is independent evidence that what they're saying is true, you don't get a junior doctor within 100 miles of the BBC? Not asked. And that's how they make certain that the information that you receive is nothing to do with the junior doctor's strike. And it takes you a moment to actually always put two and two together. But it's really important that we do, because that's how they do it. That's how they twist us. And they will go on doing it, and they will do it and do it and do it because the BBC, as has been said, is an arm of the state. The BBC is not some objective chronicler of the time. It is an arm of the state. And it was set in stone, the procedure, very early on, in 1926. I think there was still the British Broadcasting Company. Greg will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. And Reith, during the general strike, sat in a government office and received his instruction about what to broadcast from the government. But Churchill had wanted to use it as a direct propaganda machine, and Baldwin, the Prime Minister, said, no, he said, much better they think we're independent than they believe us. And that's what they did. And they have this pretense of objectivity where, in fact, it is propaganda on behalf of the broader interests of the state. So they might well be against a particular issue of a particular government, but they represent what are seen as the broader interests of the state. And I think that's really important that we have to understand their constitutional position. Why is Jeremy Corbyn so attacked? I think this has been talked about, but I think, to me, it is because he is the first Labour leader since its inception that is a real threat to capital. Every other Labour leader has adopted the position the boss has got to make a profit before we can have our services. Even the welfare state founded under Attlee was there to provide a secure, healthy, well-housed working class that would do the jobs to rebuild the country, the economy. And proof of that, Churchill and Macmillan and the people who followed, they left it in place. They left it in place because that's what capital needed then. Then came Thatcher, then came the neoliberals, then came the rampant expansion of capital, and they don't want it now. Capital now has to expand. It has to expand into our public services, into housing, into health, into transport, into everything, into the police force. Everywhere capital has to expand. Now, if you have a Labour Party that says, well, actually, we're going to kick you out of the health service, we're going to kick you out of transport, you're not going to be building houses, we're going to do it by direct labour. If a Labour leader is so going to restrict what capital can do, then they're going to make enemies. And if you add to that, to destabilise what the West sees as its nuclear arsenal, and we're going to remove ours, the whole arms industry, the whole complex is going to be after him, after them, after us. So I think it was right to say that the dirty tricks we've seen so far is kindergarten stuff. Just think of the enemies that the Labour Party will have. The international monetary organisations, the World Bank, the IMF, the whole European Union, bureaucracy at the top that have destroyed Greece, plus the military complex. So it's a huge, if we really make progress, we've got to really think very clearly about how we're going to fight back. And we've got to be prepared for every dirty trick that's going. And I think that what was said was quite right, that it has to be a mass movement, and the strides that have been made in that are absolutely extraordinary. And I think James and the many people working in Momentum have done an amazing job, something I would never have imagined was possible. Have done an amazing job, and it has to be a mass movement. I think Greg was right. There are some things that we can do in the short term. I mean, I think it's worth doing. And if you saw me fiddling with my phone, it wasn't to receive calls, it was just to write down the number. If you've got a pencil and paper, by the way, this is the number if you want a BBC complaint. It is, you probably got it, but jot it down, 037 00 100 222. I'll say it again at the end of the broadcast. That is, and the first option you'll get will be, do you want to make a comment? Don't go there. The second one will be, do you want to say something nice? Don't go there. The third one will be, do you want to make a complaint? You get to very nice people. They were working from the north of Ireland last time I spoke to them, and they write down what you say and they put it on the duty log. So it's worth it. Well, it's worth it. It makes you feel better. It may be useless, but it makes you feel better. 037 00 100 222. Give it a whirl. Okay. But it's down to match membership. I've spoken too long. The one thing I think we have to do for the long term is to think about a media policy so that we're not just complaining. The media policy to democratize the press, that the freedom of the press is not the freedom of rich people to own papers to put forward their own propaganda. That is not the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press, it has to be, it's only me speaking personally, but I would suggest ideas we put forward include that to have a license to run a newspaper, you have to be a collective of journalists and also people who work on the paper. No test for what you think, no test for what you're going to write, but it has to be collective of people who have that consensus or think that their idea of running a paper is worth doing. That's who should run papers. Collectives of journalists and people who would agree with them or want to work with them, from the cleaners upwards. The BBC, public broadcasting is absolutely vital, but don't link it to the way the BBC is now. And we defend public service broadcasting, but it must be democratized by the people who work there and have an input from the communities who in different parts of the country and from the wider society. But it must have a democratic element, not the top-down, appointed by the state, appointed by the government, appoints the news editors, appoints a safe pair of hands. We can do it, but don't underestimate the size of the task. And as Greg said, this is a historic moment. It's a historic moment because we have a sliver of opportunity to change the Labour Party, to make it the Labour Party the Labour movement has always needed. Never happened in my lifetime. I don't think it's been there since the start of the Labour Representation Committee over 100 years ago. It's an extraordinary political moment, and we have to stick with it, and we have to see it through. We can do it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ken.